Time, an infinitely finite resource. You're always spending those precious seconds holding a direction without taking into account the implications. How to pace yourself correctly is something that Team Eminence, smallchildlord, should be able to teach you, along with some other neat ideas like how to change when necessary and what you're even supposed to do in these paces. So how do you pace yourself? Before learning how to pace yourself, you first need to know the different kinds of pacing. There are 3 different kinds of paces, all of which have their own extremes. The first, and in my opinion most important kind of pacing, is relativity. This is how fast your game plan and movements are in relation to your opponent. This can vary wildly from being perfectly in tune to being entirely opposite to them. Then there is the BPM. This is how quick your game plan is. This is more general than the next way of pacing, being more so whether you're defending or approaching than anything. Finally, there's the mash meter. This is how quick you are to act within your BPM. This essentially gauges how many buttons you're pressing. After knowing all that, you need to gauge what the best pace is for each category given the situation. Though that is easier said than done. There are a lot of factors to take into account, and the importance of each varies from situation to situation. For example, although being in the lead can allow you to slow down, the expectation of that slowdown can outweigh that and allow for more aggressive plays. In other situations, such as when the lead is larger or you've been aggressive in the past, you can be more defensive without repercussion. You need to be categorizing what factors are important to the pace of the match and change your pace accordingly. So, how do you figure out the important factors? In general, you can sum up the factors into important chunks. I would say that there are 4 chunks to be divided into a few subcategories which can be further divided. I'm not going to divide everything for you since it can be very difficult to have one concrete set of rules that you always go by in fighting games. There's even a chance that the exact broad chunks that I bring up aren't the whole picture either, so take this information as a rough guideline more than gospel. The chunks that I see in pacing are the matchup, the situation, the state, and the opponent. The matchup can dictate the pace a lot, since if you have the tools to play one way but not in another, you are obviously going to play in the way that you have tools. An example would be a rushdown character like Roy playing against a zoner like Mega Man. The relative paces are going to be entirely opposite to each other, with Roy playing a lot more aggressive than the defensive Mega Man. Though, even in seemingly clear-cut cases like this, there are exceptions. The matchup isn't everything, since different people play characters differently. That's why the situation is important as well. What I mean by the situation is what exactly the stats are in the moment. How much stage is there? Who has the lead? Questions like these give the situation, and knowing that can guide you into a narrower cone of paces. For example, if you have a lot of stage control, that gives you a lot of wiggle room to play more aggressive. Though the exact situation isn't always accurate to what will happen. That's why there's the state. This is the standard disadvantage, advantage, and a neutral. The amount of pressure there is on either player. If you're in advantage, you're going to want to be a lot more aggressive than if you were in disadvantage. Neutral is where things can get tricky though, and that's where the final piece of this never-ending puzzle comes in. Your opponent, believe it or not, actually has an influence on how you should be pacing yourself. Getting everything else is easy with enough experience, but your opponent can make things a lot more difficult if you aren't prepared. Well, what about the opponent? So, taking into account your opponent requires that you notice not only everything else, but also the pacing at which your opponent is at now and where they were in other situations. This is where the different types of pacing I mentioned earlier come in. In general, you'll either want to be nearly in tune with your opponent or very far from their pace. However, you almost never want to be in total opposition or sync. Doing this leads to more coin flips, which makes things a lot more based on chance. Deciding whether to be close or far from your opponent is dependent on just about every other factor I've listed, as well as a few extra ones, such as how well your opponent can deal with a certain pace. However, one thing is for certain, and that is that you can always find a pace that counteracts your opponent's. Though, in general, playing on defense allows you to gain more information on how you should be playing, and playing on offense allows you to use that information. When it comes to the mash meter, if your opponent is on either end of the extreme, it can be incredibly easy to deal with. Whenever someone is mashing a lot, they are generally using the same few moves, and as such are leaving themselves open in the same few ways. This can mean easy punishes if you're keen. If your opponent almost refuses to press buttons, that's a very similar situation. This is generally a case of stay on the opposite side of your opponent, but not in total opposition. This is not to say that you should mash if your opponent isn't, but that you may want to hold back less if you notice them holding back more. Alright, so what about mixing up your pace? This is very effective at a higher level, since whenever your opponent senses your pace, they'll be looking more so for options that are related to that pace. Whenever you change your pacing suddenly, you also want to change the option you use at that pace. For example, if you've been defending with falling aerials, chances are your opponent will expect you to use a falling aerial whether you're defending or not. Your pace, while important, isn't going to cover for your option. You still need to keep other options in mind, not just how you use them. Don't get this mixed up with timing either, since that basically creates options on its own, while pacing is simply the reasoning behind that option. Though once you figure pacing out, learning when to use each pace will be crucial to leveling up, since keeping the same pace is similar to having a static game plan. It is a flaw that a keen player will keep track of and take advantage of. You may even have a certain pace in a specific situation without realizing, and that is what gets you punished. Footnote for mixing up your pace. Alright, so I realized this was a bit vague and I already recorded it, so I'll explain it in more detail here. What I'm talking about is that if your opponent has to account for different options per pace, that makes it a lot more difficult since they have to think a lot more to stand on even ground. If you're mixing up your pace and using different options within each specific pace, that puts a bigger burden on your opponent than if you were to simply use the same option, but with a slightly different tone. So how do you use pacing against your opponent? Pacing is something you should use in tandem with other factors like focus, as it's more of a support than anything. Using pacing as a confirmation or extra information can be crucial when you just don't have all the pieces put together, which is why it's important to keep this in the back of your mind at all times. You first want to know how your opponent acts in relation to your pace. Recognize your own pace, then look at your opponent's. How are they acting at the speed at which you're playing? You also want to see how they'll act when you have a radical shift of pacing. For example, if you're on a consistent slow pace and your opponent is matching you, you may want to see how they'll act if you suddenly aggress just a little bit. How they act with that small act of aggression can give you a lot more information than it would originally seem. Assuming you don't get mixed up, that could even lead to a free punish when you want to break a stalemate or get rid of a lead. But when it comes to people that are far in one area and are proficient at it, that may be where things get difficult. You may need to formulate counterplay right then and there in order to beat out the pacing and options of your opponent. That is the general idea of pacing. When your opponent is being too aggressive, then you must simply go on the defensive and vice versa. When one isn't being particularly aggressive or defensive, then mixing up your own pace can throw them off and force them into an extreme that you can take advantage of. Though none of this matters if you don't consider your options. I already said that you need to look at your options as well as your pace, but I feel the need to underscore that here. The exact options you and your opponent use are much more important than the pacing behind those options. If you're not taking that into account, it doesn't matter how fast or slow you're playing. You must pick good options as well as good pacing. Pacing is only a tool to trim down the options you need to consider, not a concrete win condition. That's why I had a very rough time trying to figure out what pace you need to be at. It's all situational, and those situations give rise to options that are more effective than if you were to have a worse pace. And that's all, folks! Pacing is a pain. Knowing how you should be using your time can be mentally draining with the amount of information you need to take in. Though, as long as you can keep up or slow it down, you should be fine. Calm down, keep up, and make sure you're on time. This has been Pacing by Team Eminence, smallchildlord. Please subscribe for more Smash-related content.